Welcome, friends. Welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning and the Old Cookbook Show. Today we're gonna do a recipe for, if you live in the United States, just to the south of me across the lake, you would call it an English muffin. If you live across the Atlantic in England, you would just call it a muffin, or perhaps you would just call it a muffin. Just enough. Emptied the bag. Okay, so this is one of those recipes where the history is muddled, and almost purposefully muddled. Now, I hate to say that. If you look at or watch some very large, very famous YouTubers here on YouTube making English muffins on their channels, they give this history of the English muffin is invented in New York City in the 1890s. When in fact, it was not. It was not. There was a company in New York City in the 1890s called Thomas's, who coined the phrase, perhaps, English muffin, although this cookbook that we're going to do the recipe from today, the Philadelphia Cookbook by Mrs. Rorer, was published in 1886, and the recipe is called English muffins. Some people mistake an English muffin for a crumpet, and if you look one recipe down on that page is a recipe for a crumpet. We're going to do that in another video. It is a different yet somehow related breakfast food. So I've got some milk here. I'm supposed to scald it. I've also got some butter that I'm supposed to melt into it. So I'm going to put the butter in and let that melt into the milk. I'm also supposed to have a half cup of yeast. In this time period, as we've said before, people would get yeast from the brewery, bring it home, and keep it alive in their kitchen in a liquid bath of potato mush and sometimes hops, and keep it alive, and then they would just scoop off how much yeast, liquid yeast, they needed for the recipe, or they would go every time to the brewery and get some new liquid yeast. It's not sourdough. No one was keeping sourdough in this time period. So in order to make the recipe correct for liquid-wise, we're going to take some modern dry yeast and just mix it into the water. I'll let it bloom, but you don't have to let it bloom. And getting back to the origin story, I've got some flour. I'm going to add some salt to that. Someone who has worked in television advertising for most of my adult life, I find it terrifyingly hilarious that all of the people talking about this origin story in New York City also go on and on and on and on about nooks and crannies.
Just look at those nooks and crannies.
Oh, yeah.
So crisp and crunchy.
Definitely the crannies.
It was the nooks.
Crannies. Look, Toast doesn't have any.
The connection between the origin story and the nooks and crannies is a giant ad campaign that a particular brand of English muffins in the United States ran when I was a child. And they claim to be the one with all the nooks and crannies. They're also the company that's claiming to have invented English muffins. And so this invention idea and the nooks and crannies idea in this ad campaign is sort of one of those situations of say it loud, say it often, say it with confidence, and it becomes truth and reality when it's just a marketing message. And I that's just hilarious to me. So let's look at the books. We're going to do the one out of the Philadelphia Cookbook from the 1880s. When we look at English cookbooks, this is Mrs. Beeton's cookbook, Mrs. Beeton's cookery book. Same page, in this book, we have crumpets and muffins. This is in England. They don't need to call them English muffins. They're just muffins. Kind of like when I'm in English Canada and I order French toast, but when I go to French Canada, when we go to our place in Quebec City, it's pain perdu, because it's not French toast there, it's pain perdu. This is The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glasse, published in London in 1748. This is an actual book published in London in 1748. there's a recipe in here, how to make muffins. As you read through it, you realize this is an English muffin recipe. Slightly different because it's much older and, things change over time. But this is, you make a dough, it's kind of a slack dough, you pat it out, you bake it on a cooktop, on a stone. This is an English muffin. This is the Virginia Housewife, published in Philadelphia in 1856. So well before the New York City origin story. And on page 139, a recipe for muffins. Not English muffins, they're just called muffins at this point. And it is, for all intents and purposes, the modern recipe for English muffins. And so history can be tough. It really can be tough to sometimes tease through what's real and what's not real. And part of the problem is if you're only doing your research on the internet, it's very difficult to parse out what's reality and what's just what someone said on a web page 20 years ago that has just propagated by people cut and pasting, taking it as truth, amplifying it, and making it into a bigger truth down the line, even though it has no basis in reality. And I think that's what happens a lot with recipes, because getting all of these cookbooks into one place and finding the information is incredibly tough. Okay, the milk is scalded. I'm going to set it here until it's lukewarm. Okay, the temperature on this should be pretty good by now. We're good. So, stand mixer, not a thing in this time period. I know, whatever. I'm going to use it because I've got it. So, flour and salt went in. The order of mixing doesn't really matter. In goes the milk and butter, and then the water and yeast. And just make sure I get all of that yeast out. I'm just going to give it a bit of a stir with the spoon. You're going to see at this point it's just a batter, really loose batter. So the instructions are to beat it continuously for 5 minutes. You could get a bigger spoon if you wanted to. You could put it on the stand mixer with the paddle attachment. You wouldn't need to go 5 minutes with the paddle attachment, that's for sure. The idea is you're just moistening the flour with the milk, water, and yeast, getting it all mixed together. Then I'm supposed to let this rise for a couple of hours or become light. And as is kind of the way with a lot of these recipes in this time period, I'm then going to have to add more flour. The flour amount is up to me. It's not listed in the ingredient list or the method. So we'll figure that out in a couple hours. Okay, that looks light, nice and bubbly, jiggly. Look at that. As is typical, not a whole lot of instruction from this point. It just says add flour until it makes a light dough. So we're just going to add flour until it makes a light dough. I know this is supposed to be a fairly sticky dough, so I'm going to be very careful with how much flour I add. This is the kind of thing where the first time you do it, it's just exploration. I might fail. I may not get to the right place. The next time you do it, you'll kind of know a little bit better. By the third or fourth time you do it, you'll know how it's supposed to look. I've said it before. I'll probably say it dozens and dozens of times. Don't be afraid to fail. Every failure is just one step closer to knowing how it's supposed to be done. Okay, so I pulled it off of the stand mixer because I wanted to play with it with my hands, and I think I've got what would qualify as a soft dough. Still a little bit sticky, but quite soft. I'm going to cover this and let it rest for 10 or 15 minutes before I start to shape it. And the recipe says to divide into small balls and place in a greased muffin ring. I don't know how small the small ball should be. I've seen other people sort of roll it out and then cut it. I might do that. I don't know. I've got 15 minutes to decide. Okay, a little bit of flour out on the board. And get the dough out here. I'm actually going to cut the dough in half. Let's just deal with half at a time. So, I've decided to roll it out and use a biscuit cutter and put it into the muffin rings, and we'll see how that works out. The dough is nice and soft. It's going to roll out really nicely. A little bit of a spring back, but it's okay. Now, take the biscuit cutter and cut some dough. And then we'll lay the dough inside a ring. Okay, so I'm out of rings at this point, and I've still got dough left. And it's also the sort of thing where you can re-roll several times. And I also imagine you could just cut them and let them rise like this and not worry about using the rings. So this dough is going to go back in here, and I will come back to that later. We're going to cover these over with some tea towels and let them rise. So I think we got a pretty good rise here. Not totally even, but I think this looks pretty good. We'll get them over to the griddle. At this point, I was on the fence about leaving the ring around them. I don't think the shape is going to change that much that I would need to leave the ring. I think if I got much more rise, possibly would have been a good idea. I did use parchment paper to keep them from sticking to the tin when they rose. I still think a layer of flour or cornmeal would be a great idea, even though it's not in any of these recipe books. Would be a great idea. Would make it easier to get it off. Now the idea is, and it says it in several of the books, to cook them all the way through without burning the outside. So don't have your griddle too hot. I come across a few recipes that say get them cooked like 70% of the way through on both sides, and then stick them in a 350-degree oven to finish baking all the way through. Let's see what happens. And a couple of the recipes say to flip often, so let's flip often and see what happens. So this is cast iron. I use cast iron all the time. I don't want to run afoul of the cast iron army. But one of the problems with cast iron is it doesn't heat evenly. There are hot spots and cold spots. This would be so much better on, say, carbon steel. So I've put 4 more on, and these have been around for a little while, so I'm just going to keep turning them over. I've moved them to the outside of the pan, which is the colder spot on this particular pan. And I think these ones are maybe ready for a flip. And I'm sure these are just like every other bread, 190 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle when they're done. It doesn't feel like they're done just yet. Okay, now Hannah Glasse in the 1748 version of this recipe admonishes you not to use a knife or they will be leaden. So I'm going to use a fork. The ones that I buy commercially, I can just get my thumbs in there and pull them apart.
Glen.
I've only ever pulled them apart with my thumbs,
friends.
but I don't think that these ones are... Okay.
You following the instructions she gave you?
Yes. Another... Oh, look at that. So it's supposed to look like a honeycomb inside.
Definitely the crannies.
It was the nooks.
Crannies. Look, Toast doesn't have any.
And we've got good crumb, good honeycomb. Another thing that Hannah Glasse says, and I love this. I mean, she gives...
It's pretty messy if you don't do couple pokes.
This is one of the recipes that she gives the most instructions to out of any of the recipes in here. She talks about different flours. Some flour will soak up 1/4 or 3 pints more water than other flour, which is true today. She does tell you, don't burn them or be too much colored, but you will be the judge in one or two makings. So she's pretty much telling you, you're going to fail. You're going to fail one or two times. And don't worry about that. Just keep rolling. You're going to get it right.
Those
What
are
do you
great.
think? What do you think for the first time?
Yeah, they're very impressive. They're lovely. They taste just like English muffins.
Now,
They're softer than the commercial ones.
yeah, I can see
That
that.
we're used to eating.
I can see that. I don't have a toaster out here in the studio. I don't have a microwave in the studio. I don't have a toaster in the studio. These should be toasted.
Those are going to be just fine. I'm guessing we should be able to freeze them too, hopefully. So because that's a lot to eat in a few short days. But those are good.
So English muffin, it's not a crumpet. A crumpet is
No.
something different. But the only difference between a crumpet and an English muffin, really, in terms of the recipe, is how much flour is in the batter. Is it a batter? Is it a dough? That's really the only difference. Oh, this is going to be so good in the morning with jam.
It is. It is. It's going to work out just fine.
So, lots of history here. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.
Yes, I was going to ask if you were going to be writing a full thesis on these with all these books out. It's a lot of books, Glenn.
And this is only part of it. And it's amazing because I went through a bunch of blogs reading about... And I'm amazed at how many people say that they were invented in New York in the 1890s.
No?
No. Some of these books, this is back in the 1740s. But I think the confusion is they weren't called English muffins.
They were just muffins.
They were just muffins.
From
In
England?
England,
They
they
were
were
just muffins for England?
They were just muffins. When they came to the United States. And so people's research ends at the fact that they can't find English attached to the recipe, even though it's the same recipe.
Are those the muffins the Muffin Man was selling?
These are the muffins that the Muffin Man was selling. And that predates...
Does he lives on Drury Lane?
Yes.
Uh-huh.